Did you know that the new pitcher plants are carnivores? Yes, you heard that right. One of the new plants in Minecraft 1.20 is a carnivore. So how did this happen, and what links does this have to the Minecraft lore? Well, let's find out. Our story begins long ago, 124.6 million years ago to be exact. And this was a time so long ago that the overworld we know so well was almost entirely unrecognizable, as the biomes were unlike anything that we could ever imagine. The creatures were beyond our wildest dreams. The natural landscapes is something that we could only hope to recreate, as well as the fact that there were millions of plants that covered all of it. It was a beautiful land, but at the same time, it was also extremely hot. So hot that if a player existed back then in those ancient conditions, they would burn to death in just minutes. That being said though, there was actually quite a lot of life back then, as all the plants and animals had just adapted to those harsh conditions. And one of those plants is the one that we'll be focusing on today, that being the pitcher plant. Now, the pitcher plant, to begin with, was originally a small cream-coloured boxy plant that remained close to the surface of the world, gaining all of its nutrients it needed to survive from the soil nearby. And it stayed like that for quite a while. However, as over time the pitcher plant was able to thrive in this prehistoric world, it began to not only grow in population, but also in size, as soon it became very common to find a pitcher plant that would be twice the size that it used to be. And it quickly even began to sprout green shoots from the top, as it just had an excess of nutrients. And it was from those green sprouts that the pitcher plant was able to start photosynthesizing, and thus gain even more energy. And so things were looking quite good for the pitcher plant. However, over time, things would change, as new plants would come into existence within this world, and they would be much better at absorbing the sunlight and collecting the minerals from deep under the ground. But really, that was okay, as the pitcher plant was able to adapt to these harsh conditions of life. And so for that reason, it began to grow a taller sprout to absorb more sunlight and grow a thicker base, which allowed it to dig even deeper in the soil and have roots that could collect even more minerals. And thankfully, it worked, as the pitcher plant sprout was taller than all other animals, and so it was beating them at this competition for life, as it was getting the most sunlight. However, it wouldn't stay like that for too long, as very soon other plants would also adapt to these conditions, and they would grow much taller than the pitcher plant. And well, the pitcher plant couldn't keep up with all these other plants, as they were just growing at a much faster rate. And so, it didn't take too long for the pitcher plant to be banished into the shadows of these taller plants, starved of sunlight, and losing the competition of life. Things were not looking good for the pitcher plants as a species, as for the first time ever, they were beginning to die out. But then, something very strange happened, as one of the pitcher plants had a mutation that meant it began to grow a blue flower on the top of its stalk. Now, that might sound useless, as what could a flower do to help these pitcher plants? Well, actually, quite a lot. In fact, that flower was a species saver for them. As back then, in those ancient times, there were actually very few flowers. And so, the bee. Yes, the bees were one of the very few creatures to exist back then that we still have today, but only have a very small selection of flowers to pick from. And now, they had a whole new option, which was quite a big deal to them. Furthermore, the flower on the pitcher plant was unlike any other boring flower in the overworld, as it was bright blue. And so because of this seemingly useless mutation, the pitcher plant now had hundreds of bees swarming it, which now meant a lot of honey was falling onto the pitcher plant, and that honey would fall down onto the plants and make it down to the roots, where it would be absorbed. And well, honey back then was so nutritious that the pitcher plants no longer needed to compete with the sunlight or even nutrients underground, as they could just be sustained on this honey alone. It was an amazing adaptation for the pitcher plants, and so it was over the next few thousand years that blue flower on the top of the pitcher plant would grow in size, becoming an even brighter shade of blue, so that even more bees would be enticed to get closer to these plants, and thus drop even more honey. And so things were looking very good for the pitcher plant, as they had now grown to be one of the most common and most beautiful plants in the ancient overworld. However, with all of this success came a problem. A big problem at that, as their problem was the Sniffer. Now, the Sniffer might seem like an innocent little mob, but to the pitcher plant, they were the devil, as the Sniffer loved the smell and the taste of the pitcher plant, and so because of that, they began to eat many of them. Now, this was bad, very bad in fact, for the pitcher plants, and that was for two main reasons. Firstly, the pitcher plants didn't really like being eaten. It would have been okay if the Sniffers had been subscribed, but they hadn't, so they didn't like it. And second, and more importantly, the Sniffers were greedy, and so they ate a lot of them. So many in fact that the Sniffers were eating the pitcher plants at a faster rate than they were growing. And so it was because of that that the pitcher plant began to evolve to develop defenses. Now at first, this just involved growing its flower higher up from the ground, so that the Sniffer hopefully wouldn't see it, and thus they could be saved. However, that didn't really work, as the Sniffer would always find a way to get up to it and eat it. And so things were looking quite dull for the pitcher plant. But again, all of that would change due to another mutation. As it was on one sunny morning that one of the pitcher plants somehow fused with some of the bee DNA from the honey, which led it to have a mutation where it would grow the mouth of a bee. A mouth that it could use to bite back against a Sniffer when it tried eating them. Now, these bites by no means were very strong. It was from a bee, after all, but it was strong enough to annoy the Sniffers, and thus keep them away and stop them from eating the pitcher plants. And so it was from that moment onwards that they had very few issues from the Sniffers, as that bee mouth mutation was a very strong deterrent. And so the pitcher plants continued to thrive for several million years to come. But again, everything would eventually change, as it was on one dark winter night that a bee landed right in the center of the mutated mouth of the pitcher plant, where it was consumed. Now, the pitcher plant didn't really mean to eat that bee. It couldn't control it, as it was just an instinct. However, it was from that random instinct that the pitcher plant discovered something that would cause it to change to become what it is today. As that pitcher plant discovered that one bee had the nutritious value of 1,000 bees' visits worth of honey. So it was extremely energy efficient to just eat the bees instead of waiting for them to just drop honey. And well, this knowledge spread very quickly, as it spread through the air, as that pitcher plant very quickly let out chemicals telling all the other pitcher plants what it had just discovered. And so it was from that day onwards that the pitcher plants began to shift their focus to luring in bees and eating them, thus beginning the pitcher plant's reign of being a carnivorous plant. And so it was with this influx of new energy that they were able to gain that the pitcher plants were able to spread all over the world, as now they were able to eat any bee that got too close to them. And well, many of them did. And so they were like that for millions of years, becoming a very common plant in the overworld once again. It was an amazing time for the pitcher plant. But soon, things would change. But this time, not in their favor. As soon, the overworld would enter an ice age. And well, that would be devastating to the pitcher plants, as all the bees whom they mainly ate either died out due to their sheer cold or went into a long hibernation far, far away from the pitcher plants. And so the pitcher plants had just lost their main food source. But wait, it gets worse. Due to the snow now piling onto the world and not melting away, most young pitcher plants would have froze to death. But wait, it gets even worse. Due to the cold temperatures, all the nutrients in the ground were frozen stuck. And so the pitcher plant was unable to get any nutrients from under the ground using its roots. And so because of that, they had no food sources whatsoever. And thus began mass death for all. And this process only took a few weeks before there were no more pitcher plants on the entire surface of the overworld. Yet, still, it was at this point of devastation that the pitcher plants still somehow hadn't gone extinct. Why is that? Well, as it turns out, the very thing that was killing off the pitcher plants also saved them. As when the Ice Age began and the pitcher plants were still alive, millions of seeds were released into the world. Now, normally, those seeds would have gone on to grow into brand new pitcher plants that would cover the world. But, due to the Ice Age, there was nowhere for them to grow, and instead, they were frozen. But, this was actually a good thing, as it meant that the DNA that was required to grow a pitcher plant remained in the overworld and was preserved in ice. However, they would be locked up, being frozen for the next 100 million years. And so it would be, over time, that layers of rocks and dirt would pile onto these frozen pitcher seeds, thus pushing the seeds deeper and deeper under the ground, which actually kept them quite safe from the dangers of the world above. And so the pitcher seeds would stay frozen and preserved safely for a very, very long time. In fact, it was only up until a few 100,000 years ago when the world finally began to heat up again to a temperature that the ice deep under the ground could finally start melting. And so, when that happened, millions of pitcher seeds were set free from their icy cages, and they all very quickly began to rise up through the dirt and the stone, getting very close to the surface. And they were ready to grow, just as they used to in those ancient times millions of years prior. But they never would. And so instead, they would just stay there in a limbo-like state just below the surface of the world. Why didn't they grow? Well, the conditions in the overworld were far too different now compared to their Jurassic origins. Also, the soils in the world lacked the nutrients they needed, and so it was impossible for them to grow. And so, for those reasons, the seeds would just stay there in the layers just below the surface of the overworld for thousands of years. And very luckily, as they weren't exposed to the natural elements of the world, they wouldn't ever decay during this time. Instead, they would just rise with the world, continuing to stay just below the surface. In fact, they're still there today. However, if you go out looking for any of these pitcher seeds yourself, then you won't be able to find them, as you're just unable to detect these tiny seeds by yourself. However, if you get a sniffer to aid you in this, and I'll explain more about that later, then you will be able to collect some pitcher seeds, as the sniffer recognizes that prehistoric scent, and will be able to dig out the seeds from the ground. And so, once you have obtained these ancient seeds, all you have to do to grow this plant is to just plant it in some farmland and keep it well watered. And if you do this correctly in a few days, then you will have a pitcher plant. And don't worry, it won't bite you. And so that's what happened to most of the pitcher seeds, but not all of them ended up thawing out of the ice and rising to the surface. No, something very different happened to a tiny minority of the other seeds, and the result of that affects you whenever you play the game. But to find out the influential path that those other seeds took, then we need to rewind time back just over 10 million years ago. It was a time when an advanced civilization ruled the overworld, and this civilization lived in massive cities and were very technologically advanced, more so than anything currently in the overworld. And they, for some reason, on one day, were out in their worlds in the glaciers, looking for emeralds. However, while mining down in those glaciers, they might not have found a single emerald. They did find something else instead. Something very strange, as they just found a few thousand frozen pitcher seeds. They were shocked to see that, as they'd never seen anything like these strange pitcher seeds, and so they took all those seeds that they could find and moved them over to their secret laboratories, where they began to experiment on them. Now, to begin with, many of them thought they were some sort of alien eggs, and while that wasn't entirely the case, these strange pitcher plants that grew out of them were so strange and so unlike anything that they had ever seen before that many did believe that they must be some sort of alien plant, as none of them ever thought that it would be possible for a plant to eat animals. It was so strange. But at the same time, there wasn't really much to learn about these strange plants, other than the fact that you could make cyan dye out of it. And so, because of that, they tried running some tests on these seeds, as they believed that there must be something more about them. And well, there was. But their experiments would go horribly wrong, as mutated parts of the pitcher plant seeds somehow fused with a virus that they were experimenting on down there in their lab. And well, that virus just got out of hand and was devastating, as this new fusion virus became known as the Skulk. A virus that had only gained enough strength and power to overpower this ancient civilization due to the carnivorous DNA of the pitcher plant, as that is what allowed this virus to eat XP and grow so big. That Skulk would go on to kill billions, and although you might think that its effects were limited to the ancient city, that is not the case, as it also happened to be that an entire civilization was wiped out, in part due to the Skulk, and thus in part due to the pitcher plant. And this only happened a few thousand years ago in the Trails. But to learn how that happened, then you'll need to watch this video.